bulldog and I've got monetary reform in my jaw, and I'm not going to let go. And I thought that summarized our attitude as well. So please welcome from the UK, Mr. James Gibb Stuart, and you have his talk in front of you there to refer to if needed.
How do I tune in? Am I being heard? Am I coming through? Anyone not hearing? Is that better?
Can you hear? Go ahead.
All I can say is that the last act was a hard one to follow. I can't follow it on the last that came through with that. But I can relate this very briefly to a man he just mentioned, Professor John Hodgson, who was much involved with me at that time. And one of the things that determined my approach to Malaysia was a conference I attended in Toronto just before that, where the microphones in the hall were commandeered by black people from the third world. And the thing that came through there was an insistent chant, "Get the World Bank out of our country." That's really what set off my first foray with Malaysia. Now, this conference, all I can say is, nice to be among you again. Those of you with whom I've had more than a passing acquaintance know that I'm no stranger to these longitudes. I seem to have been back and forward, in fact, several times since the days of Pearl Harbor. Post-war contacts were mainly on the Canadian side, in Toronto, where Bill Krem had started publishing the Comer Journal, and the late John Hodgson, Professor of Economics at Waterloo University, who was boldly alerting a generation of students to the fallacies of the dismal science. Meanwhile, stateside, though I was then unaware of it, there was also the likes of Stephen Zerlenga, burrowing away at the Federal Reserve system of monopoly bankerist control, which had been set up at Jekyll Island in 1913. Met with other reformers on the American side occasionally. Ken Bonsack, I think he's in here somewhere. Yeah. The Thorns of the Truth and Money book, now, I haven't heard much of them recently, but there was no pooling and dissemination of ideas until Stephen started working on his lost science of money. Let's give him a big hand, ladies and gentlemen. He didn't do it for fame. He certainly didn't do it for profit. He did it for the simple reason that it was a job waiting to be done. And all praise and honor to him. He decided to do it. This doesn't mean that he's found universal agreement, even among reformers, including perhaps some in this session. Since the last conference, I've done my best to keep up with the chit-chat and the email correspondence which followed. And broadly, I see current proposals on money reform polarizing between two distinct points of view. The first of these, which I think is favoured by AMI, is 100% money, which I take to mean, in an empirical sense, that the state should create the entire money supply, debt-free, of course, leaving the trading banks to lend only out the balances contributed by their depositors. The other is 50% money, the policy of the Canadian Action Party, and if I dare to comment briefly at this stage, perhaps containing an element of compromise between what we have and what we hope to achieve. Personally, I don't shut my mind to any coherent proposal, any thus far unconsidered aspect of the problem, but I do insist that we keep it friendly. However vehement a view may be held and expressed, we're all on the same side, and I'm sure we'll find time to give a relevant viewpoint a hearing. I'm hoping for some debate on this somewhere along the conference. let's remember also that what we advocate here is opposed by a worldwide financial establishment which will often go to a worldwide financial establishment which will often go to extreme lengths to maintain its wealth and privileges. And finding us at odds with each other, would happily join in the fracas and throw in some contentions of their own. It actually happens, you know. James Robertson, in his booklet, Money Reform, Making It Happen, emphasises that not all opposition to MR comes from public ignorance and apathy. That the emergence of any new and purposeful initiative, a debunking campaign is set in motion, taking authoritative quotes from big names in politics or banking, purporting to find serious error or naivety in the proposals. As I may have mentioned last year, that was the case when, in February 1993, Martine Hamon, secretary of the then Campaign for Monetary Reform, wrote to the British Prime Minister, John Major, putting the case for more publicly created money. She was sat upon from a great altitude when, in a reply from the Treasury, she was told that any increase in the supply of non-interest-bearing money beyond the current demand for it would cause a vast inflation. Sterling would collapse. The government would lose all control of interest rates in the economy. It wasn't true, of course. You and I know from the very fundamentals that inflation begins with usury, the lending of money at interest. Bank creates the loan money, but it doesn't create the interest, which has to be found out of further borrowing. So this canal, this about publicly created money causing inflation, is a bit of a con. A put-up job, like the pot calling the kettle black, or the top vulture blaming the pack for his indigestion after scoffing all the communal supper. That sort of thing happening all the time, of course, under the present system of deficit financing. But of course, relying upon a massive degree of public ignorance and apathy on the subject of credit creation, they seem to assume that they've got a license to turn logic on its head and expect to be believed without question. And I'm not coming through to realise it.
James, would you prefer to sit down? It's all right.
Better stand him. Looking around me today, I try to persuade myself all this must be changing. Right here in the USA, where the nation which once was the world's greatest creditor is now its greatest debtor, there's a probing and a questioning which is not going to let up until it gets some of the answers. Now, we've been trying to find some of the answers here today. According to my records, which are admittedly a bit sketchy, federal debt in this country first got over $1 trillion during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Then it was broadly acceptable because they were still under threat from the Cold War. And America, as the West's main shield against Russian collectivism, was developing a fiendishly expensive system called High Frontier. That was in the 1980s. By my latest check this summer, federal debt was being quoted at $8.969 trillion. That's just under the Congress limit. It's a sort of numerology which was seldom thought about till the advent of the computer. And trillions, correct me if I'm wrong, but that looks to me like 12 places of decimals. I understand further that when these numbers prove inadequate, we're ready with two new terms, the quadrillion and the quintillion, both of which have reached the pages of the Oxford Dictionary, but had little significance in the minds of the millions until the Fed went the zillions into the red. Okay, these sums are utterly mind-boggling, far beyond the comprehension of the ordinary citizen. Though across the border in Canada, a pocky John Hodgson was publishing in the Comer Journal a series of economic experiences and anomalies under the heading, "The Deficit Made Me Do It." So what effect does an impending $9 trillion debt have upon Mr. Henry Paulson and his team at the US Treasury, with their responsibility for controlling and managing the financial affairs of the United States? Ever think of that? If you were in any of their shoes, would it keep you awake at night? And how would you cope? How, in fact, does the Treasury team cope? Well, one thing they seem to do, as I've been learning recently, is play games with stock market prices and indices. Earlier this year, my attention was drawn to a situation involving General Motors. General Motors has been in the news again since I drew these notes together. Good old General Motors, we used to say. What's good for GM is good for America. That's a claim which, to my knowledge, was never seriously contested, even when the company and its stock had fallen on hard times. Net worth, as quoted with the latest balance sheet, was a negative $5.4 billion. A major company with a negative worth, still trading on the stock exchange. And that wasn't the worst of it. When the accountants had discounted intangible assets and deferred tax liabilities, this could arguably be rejigged to a negative $48.5 billion. Add on the fact that this industrial colossus, and it's still recently been in use, was currently in dispute with the Auto Workers Union, presumably over pay and conditions, and to the impartial accounting minds, setting sentiment and old affiliations aside, poor old GM must have seemed a prime target for liquidation. With its equity at ground zero and workers' management and suppliers scrambling for what they could salvage from the ruins. At this point, we have a very difficult situation in the stock market. So listen. Following the multi-million-dollar collapse of the Bear Stearns hedge funds, a high-profile Wall Street analyst put out a buy recommendation on GM stock, arguing, as it must have seemed whimsically, with tongue firmly held in cheek, that while the company's financial condition was a matter for concern, it was also an opportunity to secure a more favourable deal with the auto workers. And it was on this style of reasoning that the buy recommendation was founded. Now, we know, of course, that there was a strike between GM and the auto workers since this was drafted, and it's been settled. And of course, the stock has risen dramatically in the market because of that. So GM stock was being used to illustrate the state of the American market and give a false picture. I'm here recording one thing. I thought, oh yeah, right on the heels of that hedge fund catastrophe, they couldn't be serious. But it appears nevertheless that they were serious. Even in the face of this financial wipeout, GM stock closed up 6.6% on the week. That's at the time of the Bear Stearns collapse, registering its own 52-week high, a 43% gain on its low point for the period. That was stock manipulation on a massive scale to present a picture to the American public, the American investing public, which was demonstrably false. So good for GM, said the pundits. What's good for General Motors must still be good for America. You and I know, of course, that this was fair in economics. In freely traded markets, prices are based upon turnover and profitability, underlying value and sales potential, not upon the desperate need of a financial mafia to fend off a market collapse by manufacturing, not in this case motor cars, but just a set of performing figures that would gull the investing public. Okay, we didn't come here to criticise the methods and morals of the present Secretary to the Treasury or any of his team. After all, he didn't get there by false pretences. He is the guy who said he would drop dollar bills from helicopters if there was any hiccup in the flow of credit or liquidity in the financial affairs of the United States. To recall the words of a pocky John Hodgson, it's the deficit that made him do it. Okay, we've maybe heard enough about desperate administrations twisting the truth, faking indices, and incidentally lining the pockets of insiders who benefit from what they have not earned, reap where they have not sown. So We want a way out of debt and chicanery, and a fiddling of statistics and indices till they no longer provide the data, trends and factual analysis upon which an honest financial system is founded. We recognise that it's all tied up with money, who creates it, how much should be created, and who controls it after it has been created. Some centuries ago, a far-seeing Amschel Rothschild said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes its laws." That, I say, my friends, should make us very, very wary. It's happening that way just as Rothschild foresaw all these years ago in the UK with the formation of the Bank of England, and more recently in the United States with the birth of the Federal Reserve. The facility of creating new money without intrinsic backing has been entrusted to the bankers, and over the years our respective nations have incurred an irretrievable debt to a shadowy oligarchy who have apparently preempted the right to tell us in money matters what we should believe and do and think. How have they done it? C.H. Douglas, the founder of the Social Credit Party, put his finger on it when he stated that the banking system had established a monopoly upon the creation of credit, and it was the breaking of this monopoly which would be the cornerstone of any contemplated reform. Notice, by the way, that we're speaking here of credit money, not the specie or cash money, the actual metal stuff that we hand over the counter, which in the early days of banking had formed the bulk of the UK money supply. Indeed, it was only after a painstaking analysis done in the 1980s by Edward Holloway of the London-based Economic Research Council that it became public knowledge, as recently as 1948, within the adult lifespan of most of the people here, that 48% of the money supply was still banknotes and coin issued into circulation debt-free by instruments of government. It did not become public knowledge, either in the UK or elsewhere, that due to the credit card revolution and various other credit devices, this natural source of debt-free government revenue had been reduced to little more than 3% and would vanish entirely in a future cashless society. Let me say it again so that we get this at home. Just at the end of the last war, in the UK, 48% of the money was issued by government as a specie or cash money. The rest was credit. Due to the credit revolution, that money has been gradually turning into credit, and where it came as credit, it was no longer allowed as government-created money. So the credit revolution has taken over 97% of the money supply, and only 3% is still issued by government as representing the specie or metal money that hang across the table. We call it seignories over there in the UK. Ken Bonsack again, where is he again? Ken calls it sovereignty and reckons, as I do, that it should be the prime means of financing a national infrastructure, so that we never need be told again that where a need exists and skilled labour and resources are available to fulfil that need, it can't be done because there is no more money. I hope that perverted logic went out with the soup kitchen and Buddy, can you spare a dime? Last year, as a point of interest, when I was coming in from the airport to this conference, I noticed the state of some of the metal bridges, and I said, good God, the wealthiest country in the world, and it can't paint its railway bridges. Well, we'll see what happened because they couldn't maintain the steel when the bridge at Minneapolis fell down. Perverted logic with the soup kitchen. So we're onto something. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel or do handstands over the Milky Way. We're saying to our fellow citizens in Britain, Canada and the USA, what's this stuff about cash money and credit money, and the two types of money not being interchangeable? We go into a store, we make a purchase. Does it matter to the sales girl or the shopkeeper where it's paid with a credit card or banknotes and coin. Yet back in 1993, a shocked Martine Hamon was told by no less a person than the Secretary of the British Treasury that any overissue of debt-free cash money would cause a vast inflation, that the government would lose control of interest rates and the pound would be rubbished on the exchanges. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, is reputed to have argued that the bigger the lie, the more readily will it be believed. Here in this muddle-headed wrangle about the loss of seignories on non-cash money, we have a classic case in our own financial history. Let's decide from the outset that the bankers are not so obtuse as to believe their own propaganda. When Amschel Rothschild said, "Give me control of a nation's money," it was presumably the credit money he had in mind. And whether we've come to this conference as 50%ers or 100%ers, that's the essential problem for us all. How to rouse our confused and shell-shocked electorates into claiming back what I call the people's money, something which the banking fraternity has always regarded as essentially its own. But we want it back. We've got to have it back. Or we go blindly into the indefinite future, piling up staggering national and federal debts, which could one day destroy the inheritance of our grandchildren. And I put that down to the importance of our meeting today, that we come from different viewpoints. I don't believe any one of us has all the answers. But before we crystallise around our own ideas and objectives, let me say again what I've said before. Let's keep it friendly. There's nothing very particularly unfriendly about this meeting, but I've heard some unfriendly comments elsewhere in the periphery of money reform. We've got to stay together because we believe basically in the same concept of money creation by government. Money creation by government, by the people's money. And when we come to that point, the next question, which almost immediately appears, is how much money should be created? That is a question that I had to ask myself when I was writing The Money Bomb in 1982-83. I was very much my own at that time, with few contemporary examples to draw upon. But the line which the banking lobby had taken up by way of debunking money reform was to say, with massive scorn and dismissal, how can anyone know how much money should be created? What's to stop unscrupulous, power-greedy governments up for re-election, flooding the markets and debauching the currency for short-term political gain? Then we would have the pound rubbished on the international exchanges, just as we told you in the beginning, such as the scare tax. Scare taxes we had to contend with, that and the ballooning of new credit from a variety of sources, all of which would result in a vastly increased facility for public spending, ushering in what would subsequently come to be recognised as the consumer revolution, with all its dangers of inflation, balance of payment problems, etc. What Alan Greenspan was subsequently called irrational exuberance. So in the UK, back there in 1983, with a reformist government, that's the Thatcher government, a reformist government in power, and a clearly expressed desire to get the nation out of debt, my own thinking had centred on the fact that the first call upon the finances of every debt-laden British government seemed to be the funding of interest on the national debt, done via a debt instrument called the Public Sector Borrowing Requirement, or PSBR, which at that time was approximately £12 billion per annum. So in answer to the very speculative discussions about widely publicly created money and how much money should be created, I said then in Money Bomb, some Money Bombs kicking about here in the hall, I said it in Money Bomb on page 150, let us create, for a start, just enough to pay the interest on the national debt. Call it debt interest redemption stock or what you will. Do that successively year by year, and you're left with a contingency sum which rolls over as an internal statistic of government. Year by year you do the same thing, you create enough money to pay the interest on the national debt. That was a simple proposal. Remember that by this time Thatcher herself had called the national debt money that we owe to ourselves. And if you look at it that way, why in heaven's name should we go on making the debt any bigger? For without this borrowing, and at that time we in the UK had all the ingredients of a stable, non-inflationary economy. When we talk about national debt, you in the States can relate it to federal debt, which is mushrooms as we know year by year. So why did Margaret Thatcher not adopt this or some such similar proposal when she was at the very peak of her political power? I myself have it on record that had various ginger groups within the Thatcher government rather liked this idea. They had been working towards a policy of zero inflation and had been thwarted by the sums siphoned off to pay the debt interest. You and I know, and we've mentioned this often, that where there's interest to be paid, you can never get rid of this debt. It just keeps on escalating. Thatcher herself, Margaret Thatcher, was in a quandary. She was under threat, physical threat, both to herself and her family. Her wayward son, Mark, was always a ready and vulnerable target for kidnap or assassination, and she herself had already made some dangerous enemies. The Brighton bomb was intended to wipe out her and her whole cabinet, and there were other warning signs that the finance establishment were out to destroy her politically, particularly if she showed signs of adopting any of the reforms which concern us here. On the other hand, the bankers, the movers and shakers, call them what you will, so taking exception to any attempt at money creation by government, seemed to be indicating that they sympathised with her objective of getting the nation out of debt. They would do it, they said, without undertaking such a controversial step as government creating its own money. They would do it by privatising the nationalised industries, what Harold Macmillan, a former Prime Minister, would call selling off the family silver. Be clear about this. We had asked that we finance the interest in the national debt with public securities money. They wanted to finance it by another means, selling off the nationalised industry. They saw two advantages from this proposal. Not only could they sidestep this tendentious issue of breaking the credit monopoly, there were also the fat fees to be creamed off from such a flood of new stock issues, all of which, said the broking houses, would cause such mountains of cash to descend upon the exchequer as would write off the national debt several times over. This may not be very much remembered, but at that time they actually had young financial journalists who were writing in the London papers saying that when this privatised stock hit the market, the need for gilt-edged securities would disappear. The reality, of course, was something different. The bankers who floated the privatisation stock got their fees. The public got its cheap offerings of the national assets, Macmillan's family silver. But when the party was over, the borrowings began again because they had missed out on one crucial factor. When it comes to selling assets, you can't sell the same lot twice. So there are wily bunch the establishment bankers, and never more wily than when in defence of their 300-year-old credit monopoly. So when the time comes to force significant changes in that relationship, it will be necessary to have them monitored every inch of the way. That's the point that I try to emphasise myself. We can't make airy-fairy proposals and expect them just to be adopted with a nod of the head. Every initiative that has been tried in the last few years, they've always come up with something evasive or fraudulent to lead us off the track. I go on to make the point here that that doesn't mean we should try to curb or abolish the banking industry itself. Personally, I get smiling at efficient service from our local bankers and wouldn't want to see any detrimental changes in that relationship. To me, it would be too much like a repeat of the baby in the bathwater syndrome, and I'm inclined to think that if the high street banks didn't exist at the moment of deliverance from public debt, we would probably have to reinvent them. This is apropos of a certain argument that seems to be going on even within the AMI, about 50% money, 100% money, etc., and what the role of the bankers would be after that happened. I maintain that if the high street banks didn't exist at that moment, we would probably have to reinvent them. And I attempt to tell you why. If we look at them both from the public and private viewpoints, we see that most of our campaigning is actually concentrated on the public sector, insisting that government and infrastructure, health, environment and social amenity should have access to that store of wealth and resources which accrues to the collective worth of the developed nation state and is there when needed for the benefit of all. What we're saying here is what Douglas has said years before when he propagated the idea of his national dividend. There's a great store of wealth within the nation itself which should be spread around the whole nation, and citizens of that nation are entitled to ask for their share of it. Thus, we are citizens of that nation state. So we don't expect to pay at this stage all over again, either in debt interest or in taxes, for that to which, as citizens, we have already contributed. We are the nation, we have an entitlement, there's a net worth that's been gained there, and we should be sharing in it. Thus, we don't expect to pay all over again. We don't expect to pay for roadways or bridges or public buildings or other national amenities. And especially do we resent our elected government continuing to borrow 97% of the money supply at interest, since we realise that that just gets tacked on to a burgeoning national or federal debt. That's one side of the coin, that there must be an end to public borrowings, since it's obvious that public borrowings never get paid off. On the flip side, the other side of the coin, we have the private sector, where, when it's functioning at its best within the framework of an open society, we encounter a bewildering array of entrepreneurial investment, inventors and innovators, explorers and developers, a whole breed of merchant adventurers who bring in the new wealth of trade resources and ideas which every generation needs and from which every generation benefits. Who would feel competent and imaginative enough to set down rigid rules for such a varied assortment of energy, ambition and ideas? In short, who in his wisdom would feel qualified to lay down the terms and conditions under which the go-getting merchant adventurer gets his money? The reassuring thing, of course, is that we don't need to, for come or go, rain or shine, boom or bust, looking at both the corporate enterprise and the individual operator, whether they borrow high or borrow low, whether they pay back their debts with interest or end up in the bankruptcy courts. It's safe to say that the final sum of their manifold activities will remain between them and their lender. Neither will become a charge on the public revenue. I hope this point is clear. It may come out in the question, if there are any. This doesn't mean that the big bang of the 1980s, with the lending and borrowing excesses which have followed, there is no need for re-regulation and control. In his day, C.H. Douglas had tried to put a monetary value on his native homeland, its people, its resources, its wealth and strength, etc. But the high priests, and I'm moving from there to Wall Street, by the way, but the high priests and gurus of modern hedging and derivatives have long since discarded any links with value or reality. When the Bear Stearns hedge fund encountered VAR, which is value added risk, in the summer of this year, it was facing meltdown at a rate of $28.7 million for every trading day. I make that $1.2 million for every hour, $20,000 for every minute, $330 for every second, with no apparent supervision or the creation or leverage on these debt instruments and their electric modifiers, the negative worth of General Motors. That doesn't seem too utterly ridiculous. In smart financial circles, we seem to have moved completely away from the concept of money as a store of value or an acceptable, if imperfect, means of rewarding our individual contributions to the sum of human achievement. So now the figures record not what they mean, but what they want them to mean. Here's a bit of Irish blarney. It's all in the minds as the legendary Irishman at the gate. My mother's mother was Irish, so I'm entitled to tell it. It's all in the minds as the legendary Irishman. He has to be an Irishman, for only the Irish could expect to understand the sheer inconsequentiality of piling loss upon loss, debt upon debt, and balancing out with a self-cancelling switch at the end of the bottom line, which is how it seems that the financial markets are operating today. What is not self-cancelling, say I, is the public debt we had around our necks the day we were born. That's the one we'll have to keep in our sights till the debate has been resolved. And let me quote again, as I've probably quoted before, the words of Sir Robert Menzies, a former Prime Minister of Australia, when he said, "There can be no independence without financial independence." That's really what it's all about.